Randall was the first to reach the beach, clambering down the steep cliff face like some kind of monkey, hands darting effortlessly to locate holes that Boyd, 30 feet behind him, was struggling to find. A climber by trade prior to joining the expedition, Randall sat down on a rock while he waited for Boyd to catch up. As he waited, his eyes swept back and forth across the wide beach, taking in the tall cliffs on either side, one of which they would need to negotiate tomorrow to get back to camp, the tide line 200 meters distant, and there, before you reached the first of the lapping waves, the scores of sand stacks he had seen from the cliff top. Dotted across the beach, there were maybe 80 of them, at this distance all perfectly uniform, 7 or 8 feet high, maybe 2 feet in diameter. They appeared roughly conical, but even to Randall's unaided eyes, he could tell they were far more than mere sand dunes, from the way the tops didn't appear smooth or rounded, but staggered, layered, as though someone had moulded them into castle shapes before abruptly disappearing. "What are they, do you think?" Boyd said, huffing, finally reaching the bottom of the cliff. "You ever seen a picture of a termite mound?" Randall nodded. "Yeah, but no, too close to the shoreline. Even with the shallow tides this planet has, they're going to last hours at best." "So who built them?" "Search me." Looking through binoculars from the cliff top, Randall and Boyd had believed they had finally found signs of intelligent life. They both remembered the snakes they had found 2 days ago with less than fond memories. That had been the closest they had come. "Whoever made them can't have gone far," Boyd said. "They would have been made since last high tide, 7 hours? We saw no one from the cliff top, so maybe there's a settlement back at the base of the cliff, maybe even in the bedrock underneath." Randall nodded noncommittally. "I could understand them hiding from those snakes. Good God. Serpents, more like." They'd come across a nest in a ravine about 40 miles inland. Their sensors had detected a heat anomaly, but it hadn't been moving as an animal would, and they had mistaken it for something as harmless as a hot spring. Ignorantly, they had walked right into the serpent's nest. One man from their expedition force had died before they had got their guns out. They had only killed one of the creatures, like for like, but they had all seen them before they disappeared into tunnels in the bedrock. The one they killed had measured in at 18 meters, with a body of half a meter at its thickest, but there had been others far, far bigger. Randall gazed out to sea. 24 degrees centigrade here. It could be the coast of England, or America, or Australia, or practically anywhere else back on Earth. Plant life had evolved very similar, as had smaller life forms such as rodents, birds, and insects. They had found butterflies with wingspans a meter across, but that was barely larger than back in the old Amazon. The snakes, however, remained consistent with their ongoing findings that the planet had somehow evolved without attaining a higher life form. On Earth, such large and dangerous creatures would long ago have been hunted to extinction, so maybe the snakes were the top of the food chain. Maybe, as their expedition searched the planet's endless forest, they would simply find nest after nest. "We'd better go take a look," Boyd said after a few minutes. Randall nodded. They headed down the beach. The rocks at the base of the cliff extended a couple of 100 feet or so before the beach turned to sand, mainly grains of igneous rock like basalt and granite, ground fine over the centuries. There were dunes here, topped with campus grass, rolling away for another 100 meters or so before hitting the field of strange sandcastles, and then the sea beyond that. The water was almost lake calm out there, the tiniest of waves lapping gently at the shore, no sign of a swell whatsoever. They reached the first of the sandcastles, Boyd slightly ahead of Randall. "My God, what do you make of that?" This time Randall shook his head. "I have no idea. It's extraordinary." The thing was 2 meters tall, shaped roughly like the head of a missile, except the top was carved almost into an intricate web of small towers and buttresses, as though someone had been sculpting a fantasy castle before abruptly disappearing. One thing was for sure as they walked around the sand stack. It wasn't natural. Whatever made it clearly had some form of intelligence. "So what do we do now?" Boyd asked. Randall cautiously approached the stack. He put his fingers out to touch it. "Maybe it's made of rock," Boyd said from behind him. "No one can make a sandcastle like that, surely. It's—" Randall's hands sank into the stack up to the wrists. A moment later, pulling back, the top fell away, cascading away in a shower of sand chunks packed hard by the afternoon sun. "Impossible." Randall smiled. "Whatever it is, I think we can safely say it's made of sand. Question is, who made it and why? I guess we need to try and find that out." For the next 2 hours they skirted back around the shoreline, picking through the rocks and examining every cave in the cliff face that they came across. Boyd felt sure they would eventually find the entrance to some underground city, while Randall was strangely quiet as they carried out their task, preoccupied with the sand stacks. He remembered something he had noticed from the cliff top earlier, how the stacks had not just been numerous, but almost methodically arranged into groups of 8, forming octagons of sandcastles dotted across the sand. Yet these octagonal groups didn't seem to have any sort of order, rather were scattered at random across the beach, sometimes overlapping, encroaching on other octagons, as though a group of builders had been fighting over the supremacy of the beach, and in the end had taken stalemate. And there were the depressions too, scattered across the beach, appearing from a distance to be no more than pools near the shoreline, with their edges gently curved over several hours of water treatment. When you thought mathematically about it, however, it became clear these depressions were the source of the sand used to build the castles, yet they were quite substantial in size, and Randall was sure that each depression corresponded to one of the octagons. Why would they be so meticulous about where their sand came from? And how could they have done all this and left so little trace, no footprints in the sand heading back up the beach, for example? Randall was deeply troubled by the time they got back to their starting point and opened up their packs to arrange some dinner. Boyd was frustrated. He had been as eager as a child during their search for tunnels, and was clearly disappointed. None of their sensors had come up with any movement or anything recognizable as body heat. The place, to all intents and purposes, was just a beach, populated by a few crabs, some shells, and a field of post-modernist sandcastles. "I'll radio the camp after we've eaten and give them a report on our progress. What should I say?" Randall said nothing. The whole thing puzzled him greatly, but he felt sure he was close to finding the answer. There was meaning in those sand stacks for sure, and in the octagons they made. He only needed a little time to figure it out. "Randall? Huh? What should I say to base camp?" Randall shook his head. Tell them we found nothing of significance yet." "What?" "Well, what do we have here besides a few lumps of sand?" Boyd planted his hands firmly on his hips and cocked his head like an old fishwife. "Randall, now let's not start playing heroes, shall we? We're the first exploration team on a newly discovered frontier world. We've already found stuff that will make headlines back on Earth. We don't need to start concealing signs of intelligent life just to make sure we discover it first." Randall didn't look at him. "I don't give a shit about that, Boyd. Something's worrying me and I don't know what it is. Give me a couple of hours to think it over, and then we'll call in." Boyd's eyes became slits. "A couple of hours, Randall." It would be more than that. As they sat down to eat, Randall surreptitiously sprinkled Boyd's food with a little omega-4 powder, a simple drug designed to help them sleep better when a world's atmospheric carbon count or gravity level was causing them irritating aches and pains. Randall hadn't used any on this trip, but he always brought some with him, a contemporary equivalent of what used to be known back on Earth as aspirin. Soon Boyd was sleeping soundly. Randall packed their things away and set up a tent for the night at the base of the cliff. then hauled Boyd inside and wrapped him up in his sleeping bag. Certain his companion was safely asleep, Randall took a pouch of tobacco from his bag and sat on a rock a few feet away from the tent to watch the sunrise. Over a mirror-like ocean, and faced with a cloudless sky, the sunset was beautiful, a plethora of wonderful colours reflected by the ocean, 1,000 rainbows caught in a bucket and stirred up together. Randall sat in silent contemplation, slowly sucking back on a succession of hand-rolled cigarettes, watching the sun go down, slowly sucking onto its colours it had created, like an artist destroying his creation. Perhaps 10 minutes after the sun had set, he saw the first flicker of movement on the horizon. He frowned, watching carefully. For another 5 minutes he sat there, and nothing further happened. He was about to label it a trick played by the lingering traces of sunset on his eyes, when it happened again. Momentary, almost impossible to see, but he had certainly caught it nonetheless. A tiny flicker of lightning that could be the sign of an incoming thunderstorm, except that it had flickered up from the water into the sky. No electrical storm worked that way. Randall had studied physics at school and knew that the ocean didn't give off bolts of electricity like it appeared. He knew what it meant, that it was caused by something on or in the water. And whatever it was coming closer. 10 minutes passed, and to Randall's eyes the bolts of electricity grew from a pinch to a finger in length. The thing, whatever it was approaching with such speed that Randall knew it couldn't be any form of boat. It was some form of sea creature, a fish or a whale, but it had properties 100 years of space exploration had never encountered before. Randall dropped his last cigarette into a pool of water by his feet. He knew suddenly that if the creature saw or smelled him, he would die. Larger waves were beginning to roll up the beach, and Randall knew that the thing must have such size as to be unimaginable. His heart was pounding so hard that he was terrified it would hear him. He was also terrified that Boyd might wake up. Boyd, if he didn't give them away, would see this as only another life form to catalogue, and that could be their undoing. The electrical bolts were just a couple of miles offshore now. Randall could see them clearly as what happened when something short-circuited. The flashes wrapping around the body in the water, as though it were the very air that were causing it. The creature wasn't designed to leave the water. Randall shifted a few feet further forward and slipped down behind a large rock. They had no time to escape. The creature was emerging from the water. He had seen Hollywood films about kraken before, and as the monster came out of the sea, that was what he thought of, feeling as helpless as the heroine chained to a cliff. It was the size of an ocean liner standing on end. Randall couldn't make out its features because the electricity had stopped as it left the water, almost as though air balanced it out, and it was monstrous, blocking out the night sky and what little light was given off by the moons. He could tell it was vaguely bipedal, but he couldn't see what array of fins it might have, folded up now, that made it move so fast. All he knew was that this was a creature they couldn't play with. Giant snakes were one thing, immense sea monsters were quite another. If it was intelligent, their mission might be over. It walked a few meters up the beach, unsteady, as though not built for land travel, and there was a sucking, grinding sound after each time it lifted a foot. Randall knew now what had made the sandcastles. If the creature were somehow felled and its feet examined, he was sure you would find a perfect set of octagonal holes. The castles were footprints. The creature growled. It wasn't the sound of something wild and feral, but of something young and afraid, something running away, something nervous. Randall's heart pounded. The creature turned, looking towards the horizon. Its electricity flashed almost as though it was blushing, and Randall saw with horror its features for the first time. The body could be any monster of legend, scaly, tough hide, long clawed arms with webbing between the fingers the size of fishing nets. The legs were huge and muscled, built for propulsion, while the sheen of folded fins was visible down its sides, wing-like fins that would open out and allow it to glide through the water at immense speeds. But Randall would never forget the face, smooth, devoid of scales, cherubic. It was the face of a small child, 5 or 6 years old by Earth standards, even with a few wet strands of hair flowing out behind it. The creature, despite its size, was only an infant. It growled again, and this time Randall followed its gaze towards the horizon. His heart caught in his chest as he took in what he saw there. Across the horizon, from one side to the other, bursts of electricity flickered up towards the sky as the creatures of the sea rose from the depths. He knew it for what it was now. This child was a runaway, an errant, slipping away from their gaze, going to explore the great world around it, and now they were coming to take it back. Randall slumped down behind his rock as the flashes came closer. Water lapped at his feet as wave after wave rolled further up the beach. He felt like a space-age Gulliver as the water people emerged from the sea. Peering from behind his rock, he watched as huge dark towers appeared, like a city forming around him. Some of the foremost growled in a way Randall could describe only as relief, as the child creature on the beach moved forwards to find the embrace of the others. Electricity flashed, and one by one they sank back into the sea. The next day, Randall, sleepless after what he had seen, made his way down to the beach while Boyd was still sleeping. There were maybe 50 of the castles, some of them 3 meters high, and he leapt at them, pushing them to the ground, urging the lapping water of the sea to cover them up, to hide the evidence of the creatures. Base Camp couldn't find out about this. Randall wasn't like Boyd, merely a cataloguer of flora and fauna. Randall was a genuine explorer, one who believed some discoveries should be left alone, left to their own lives, left in peace. Not only would entering the seas endanger the mission, but sooner or later it would bring confrontation. Randall could barely imagine the loss of life that might ensue if these electrically charged skyscrapers marched to war. Boyd woke around mid-morning. Randall had already packed the camping gear back into their bags, leaving only Boyd's tent. Boyd looked at him warily, feeling something was amiss. "You okay?" Randall asked. "Just a headache," Boyd said, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know what happened last night, but I had some crazy dreams." Randall shrugged, remembering the electricity in the air. "Perhaps the atmosphere isn't as stable as we thought." Boyd gave him a sideways glance. "Maybe not." "We have to head back to camp today," Randall said. "If we wait until we reach the top of the cliff, we can make a clearer transmission." Boyd nodded, still watching Randall a little suspiciously. "Did anything happen in the night?" "The tide came in a little way, and washed away most of those sandcastles. Whatever made them didn't come back." "Are you sure?" "I could see you were tired, so I stayed up all night on watch. I didn't see anything." "Why didn't you wake me?" Randall shrugged. "You can do the same thing for me tonight, once we hit the forest. Just watch out for those snakes." They packed up the rest of their things, and, after eating a little breakfast, they attempted the climb back up the cliff. The ascent was almost sheer, so Randall went first, finding the handholds and attaching the safety cable, Boyd coming up behind. It took an hour, and they were tired when they reached the top. "Let's rest here for a while," Boyd said. "I'll radio base camp and let them know about those sandcastles. Maybe they'll send a larger scouting group out." "You sure you didn't see anything last night?" "Positive." Randall went to stand next to Boyd, who was pulling the radio equipment out of a bag. "Come and look at something a minute, will you?" "What?" "Just look." Randall walked to the edge of the cliff. He stood looking out over the beach, down to where the lumps of the sandcastles he had sabotaged were still clearly visible. Boyd came up beside him. "What?" "Look down there, the way they seem to be in circles of 8. "I see what you mean, like symmetry, right?" "Kind of. Imagine what kind of creature could make that if those were footprints, say. Footprints? You're out of your mind. Something like that would be incredibly dangerous to us if it had intelligence. Boyd took a couple of steps closer, leaning forwards to peer down at the beach. We have weaponry, firepower. There isn't much we couldn't take out if we had to. Those snakes just caught us by surprise. It won't happen again. Randall gave a sad nod. Yeah, that's what I thought. He stepped up behind Boyd and shoved hard. Boyd barely had time to cry out as he fell through the air, arms flailing, before landing with a sickening crunch on the sharp rocks below. Randall looked down at Boyd's broken body, watching for movement. After a few minutes, satisfied that Boyd was dead, he walked back to the radio equipment. He sighed as he sat down. He could still see out to the horizon, almost endless from up here. He remembered the beautiful water, harassed by electricity the night before, even though his body ached and his mind throbbed with the guilt of what he had done to Boyd. They had been friends of a sort, after all. Maybe he had done the wrong thing, but the others couldn't know about it. Too many people would follow Boyd, and would die. He flicked the radio to the required frequency, and held the microphone to his face. Base camp, come in, over. We've got an emergency here. Boyd's fallen. He's hurt. I think he might be dead. The end.